If I asked you to think of a time in your life when you felt morally corrupted, dirty on the inside, if you're like most people, you probably wouldn't have to think very hard. You can probably think of some event, something you did in the past that just really made you feel dirty. Even people who claim that they don't believe in moral absolutes or they don't think there's such a thing as sin or uncleanness, even those people have times when they feel it. They might use different words. Instead of dirty or unclean, they'll just say they feel inadequate or unacceptable or unfit in some way. It's a sense that there's something wrong with me, I don't measure up. Everybody feels that. Whatever words you use to describe it, this problem of uncleanness on the inside was not anything unique to the Pharisees of Jesus' time. It was a problem for every human being on the planet of all ages. It's a constant problem. If you're going to go and meet with somebody who's important to you, maybe a job interview or a first date or just some big important meeting, what do? You clean up, right? You brush your teeth, you get a haircut. When you're doing that, what are you doing? You're getting rid of uncleanness, right? You're making yourself presentable. You don't want to look bad or smell bad or come off bad anyway to this person that's important to you in the meeting. That's especially true if the person that you're meeting with is God. You need to be cleaned up. All of religion is basically how can a person get cleaned up in order to meet with God. Now, the first 23 verses of Mark chapter 7, Jesus teaches all about this issue of uncleanness. And if that's the topic, what would you expect? You would think that if he's going to talk about uncleanness, that his main point would be how to get rid of it, right? It's not. It's not what he doesn't actually say anything in this passage directly about the solution to moral uncleanness. What he talks about instead is the source of moral uncleanness. That's what he wants us to know. Why? Because the solution won't work if you don't understand the source. To deal with the problem of sin, sin has to be severed at the root. It has to be severed at the root. Most people try to deal with their sin at the level of actions. Like they'll sin there. From now on, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to change my behavior. I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to stop doing that. Or maybe they'll even take it a step further than this. I'm going to avoid influences that push me towards that sin. And that's about as far as most people go in dealing with their sin. That'll never work. Fighting your sin problem at the level of your behaviors is like trying to kill an apple tree by picking the apples. It doesn't matter how many you pick; more of them will just keep growing back after it. You can't, if you want to stop the growth of the apples, you have to cut that thing at the root. Or to put it another way, you can't fight a war if you don't know who the enemy is. You got to find the enemy first before you can engage. No matter how many tactics of warfare you master, if you're in the wrong continent, fighting the wrong country, whatever, you're not going to win the war. You got to know who your enemy is. And if you're wondering how important this is, to know who the enemy is when you're fighting your own sin, to know what the source of uncleanness is, if you want to know how important this issue is, just look at Jesus' response here in Mark 7. Look how long it is. It's one of the longest speeches Jesus ever gives in the book of Mark. Mark doesn't record long speeches by Jesus, by and large. Most of the time, what Mark does is he just records Jesus' actions. He just tells you what Jesus does. That's how he spends most of it. And then he just gives little snippets of Jesus' teaching here and there. Except here. This is a rare exception where Mark just gives a long answer. And that long answer comes in three different groups in 3 phases. All right? So this whole passage is 3 phases. Phase 1, scribes and Pharisees. He talks to them first. Then he moves on. Phase 2, he speaks to the whole crowd. And then phase 3, he's alone in the house with his disciples. And all of it gets recorded in the Bible by Mark. He wants us to see all 3 phases. So Jesus' response here to this question that they ask him about uncleanness has important written all over it. This is a big deal. And here's something interesting. This whole response, 23 verses, Jesus' response to the Pharisees' question about hand washing, the question was very simple. Why don't your disciples do the hand washing? And in Jesus' entire response, he never once mentions hand washing. He doesn't even use the word. And Jesus will do that. He often does that. He'll skip past the pretext and go right to the heart of the real issue. They ask about a ritual, he talks to them about ritualism. They ask about a certain point of religion, and he responds by just demolishing their entire religious system. And this is another reason why this is such an important topic, because if you get this wrong, your whole religion is going to be wrong. It'll corrupt your entire approach to worshiping God to where you'll be like the Pharisees. Your worship will be worthless, in vain, a waste of time. If you don't understand the source of your uncleanness, what it is that makes you unpleasant in God's sight, then you will very quickly become infected with the disease of legalism. This is what happens if you don't understand the source. If you try to grow a garden, no matter how perfect your garden is, if you just let it go, very soon it'll be taken over by weeds, right? In a similar way, no matter how pure and God-honoring your spiritual life is, if you let it go, the weeds of legalism are going to take over very quickly. It's just natural. It's the way it goes. Is a gravitational pull towards legalism. Legalism is an absolute spiritual catastrophe that every one of us is prone to, and it is impossible to avoid unless you understand the source of spiritual uncleanness. So, let's look at phase 1. That's the one we studied last time. That was his response to the Pharisees. They ask, why don't your disciples do the hand washing? And Jesus says, because it's not in the Bible. That's human tradition. It's not in the Bible, so we don't have to do it. It's worthless. Anything that's not in the Bible, worthless for curing the problem of spiritual uncleanness. And he says, you want proof? Just look at you guys. You're as filthy as can be. I mean, you're great at the traditions, and you're as filthy as they come. You're hypocrites. You're far from God, and your worship is absolutely worthless. It's in vain. You don't even let people honor their parents. You're exhibit A of how useless legalism is. So that was phase 1. In phase 1 of Jesus' response, we learn that there is no human solution to uncleanness. None. Not psychology, not religious tradition, not cleverness and problem solving in your brain. All of those things not only won't work, but they will make the problem of your spiritual uncleanness even worse. It's all dirty soap. The more you scrub, the dirtier you get. And by the way, if human wisdom did work, if you could fix the problems of the soul with psychology or with human wisdom, science, whatever, if you could do that, then Jesus wouldn't have bothered teaching about it. Have you ever noticed that Jesus doesn't teach us about stuff that we can figure out on our own? There's nothing in the Bible about how to solve air pollution, or noise pollution, or brain surgery, or rocket science. He doesn't teach about that in the Bible. Why? Because we can figure that out on our own. We don't need divine revelation for that. That's humanly possible to figure out. Jesus only taught us about things that were absolutely out of the reach of the human mind to figure out on our own. And he taught a lot about what to do about the problems of the soul, right? Never rely on human wisdom to make you clean. Don't ever let anyone put rules on you that aren't in the Bible. Don't let someone saddle you with that. I don't care if it's been a religious tradition in that church for 1,000 years. Or something your pastor's repeated so many times that everyone in the church thinks it's a Bible verse. Or if you have all kinds of cultural expectations along that, it doesn't matter. If somebody tries to tell you it's binding on you, then you say, show it to me in the Bible. If it's not there, it's not required for godliness. Because everything that's required for godliness is there in the Scriptures. All right, so that's phase 1. That was last time. Now Jesus very deliberately, this is dramatic, he very deliberately turns away from the Pharisees and addresses the crowd. He calls the crowd to him. So this response, phase 2 of his response, is for everybody. It's not just for the Pharisees, it's for everybody. And once again, we're going to see Jesus ratchet up the stakes. He's going to move it a step further. So he just shot down sacred tradition. He just shot down human wisdom, all the traditions of the elders, but he's not done. He's going to take it a step further, a huge step further. Verse 14. Jesus called the crowd to him. Now it's unusual, isn't it? We've never seen that. All the way until now in Mark, the crowds gather by themselves and Jesus is trying to get away from them, right? But now he goes out of his way to gather a crowd. Verse 14, he called the crowd to him, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Now that language comes right out of the Old Testament. That's the wording that the Old Testament prophets would use when they were about to make a divine pronouncement. This is a big deal. This is a prophetic, big-time, official statement from the mouth of God. It's like he's calling a press conference. He said, all right, get the cameras rolling, get your notepads out. This is a big deal. This is like Moses up on Mount Sinai. I'm going to make a pronouncement. I'm going to preach something to you. And listen and understand. And that listen and understand, that implies this isn't going to be easy. You got to think. You got to think. Listen and understand. Get this. So, this big prelude, and he calls them, and he gathers them. He says, all right, you ready? Here comes the sermon. Here it comes. Verse 15. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it's what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. That's all. He doesn't say anything else. That's it. The people are just standing there like, what? That's it? 2 sentences? What is that? Jesus spent almost as much time introducing his sermon than he did preaching it. I mean, he gathers everybody around. Hear ye, here. Gather around. Get this. Come over here. Listen to this. Make sure you get this. This is going to be a big thing. Are you ready? Here it comes. It's not what goes in, it's what comes out. Okay, take it easy. And he walks away. What kind of a thing? What is that? Well, he's taken us to phase 3. Okay, that's the end of phase 2. It's over. He's done talking to the crowd. Now he walks away, and phase 3, verse 17. After he'd left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. They call it a parable, which means hard saying. It's a difficult thing to understand. It was hard because it seems to contradict the entire Old Testament, right? The scriptures in the Old Testament loaded with laws about things that make you unclean if you eat them. All the kosher laws, right? The chapters about that. So how can Jesus just suddenly stand up and say, nothing that comes into you can make you unclean? Nothing. That's a hard saying. I can see why they're calling it a parable here. So they catch up to Jesus in the house and ask him. Now, why didn't the crowd ask him? They didn't care. They didn't ask because they didn't care. That's what parables do. They weed out the people who don't even have enough interest to just ask a question, what does that mean? But the disciples, they want to know. To their credit, they want to know. And so they catch up to Jesus in the house and say, hey, Jesus, you know when you said the thing about listen and understand? Well, we don't understand. We don't get it. What did that mean? And verse 18, look at his answer. He's like, are you so dull? The word dull means dumb. This is not a compliment, right? This is a rebuke. Which implies, if they would have done what Jesus said to do, if they would have just given some rigorous thought, they would have been able to figure it out. But they didn't. And so Jesus rebukes them, but then he goes ahead and just explains it to them anyway. Verse 18, he says, are you so dull? Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then out of his body. Literally, into the toilet. So, he's very graphic here. He's talking about spiritual things. He's talking about the heart. This whole section is about the heart. You see it 3 different times. Verse 6, their hearts are far from me. Verse 18, it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach. And then verse 21, for from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts and all the rest. It's all about the heart. That's what Jesus wants to point to here. You know, I don't know of any theme in Jesus' teaching more prominent than getting people to stop focusing on the external and look into the heart. Get off of the external and look at the heart. And that's exactly what he's doing here. In the Old Testament, there's 2 different kinds of uncleanness. There's symbolic, external uncleanness, and that has to do with your body. And then there's real moral uncleanness that has to do with your heart. Okay? If you do evil, if you blaspheme God, worship an idol, commit adultery, murder someone, steal, lie, all those kinds of things, you do that stuff, your heart becomes morally unclean, repulsive to God. On the other hand, if you do things like eat pork, eat non-kosher food, or you touch a corpse, or you touch a leper, or you have a baby, or all those kinds of things, those cause symbolic uncleanness. Symbolic, and it doesn't affect your heart, it affects your body. And they were illustrations of sin, not actual sin, just illustrations of sin. So every once in a while, the Old Testament prophets would stop and remind the people of that. They would remind, all these symbols, they're just symbols. Like Isaiah 1, Psalm 51, Deuteronomy 10, Ezekiel 14. Lots of passages where the prophets would remind the people, all your sacrifices, the festivals, the new moons, the Sabbaths, circumcision, external forms, temple worship, all the kosher stuff, all that stuff, you can do all that stuff until you're blue in the face. And if your heart is bad, it's all worse than worthless. Those things are symbols, pictures, illustrations, but they're not the real thing. They're not the real moral issue. Reality happens only in the heart. The only part of you, now mark this, the only part of you that can be unclean is your heart. The only part of you that can have real moral uncleanness is your heart. That's Jesus' point in verse 19. Otherwise, verse 19 makes no sense. He says if it doesn't go into your heart, it doesn't make you unclean, period. That means the only part of you that can be unclean is your heart. Nothing that happens to your body can defile you. Unless it arises out of your dirty heart, nothing that happens to your body can defile you. And that's good news, by the way, for people who have been molested. A lot of times people who are rape victims or they've been molested, they feel like they've been defiled because of what happened to their body. But your body can't be morally defiled. Do you know that? Your body can't be morally defiled. Only your heart. No rapist can do anything to your heart. Only you can. Only you can. So, Jesus pointed them back to the heart, just like the prophets, just like Isaiah 1, all those passages. This is what Jesus is doing. He's pointing them back to the heart. But that's not all he's doing, and here's where it really gets big. He's not just saying that the heart is more important than the symbols. It sounds like what he's saying here is he's eliminating the symbols altogether because the statement is absolute. Nothing that you put inside you can make you unclean at all. When Jesus uses that strong a language, what is he doing? Is he just canceling the whole kosher system? Yes. Yep. That's exactly what he's doing. And in case we have any doubt about that, Mark just comes right and tells us that. Verse 19. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Literally, all these foods that in the Old Testament that God had declared unclean, like shellfish and pork and all birds and everything, all these reptiles, all this stuff that's unclean, Jesus just makes them clean. In fact, literally here it says, cleansing all foods. Jesus, it didn't just declare them clean, he cleansed them. Jesus cleansed pork and lobster and reptiles and birds and even meat sacrificed to pagan idols he cleansed. Romans 14:14. No food is unclean in itself. Jesus cleansed it all. We see this played out in the rest of the New Testament. In Acts chapter 10, very important chapter, God commands Peter. He shows him a bunch of unclean animals in a vision, and he says, kill and eat. Eat that unclean stuff, Peter. And Peter, he practically has to get into a wrestling match with Peter to get him to eat. Peter's like, no, I would never do that. I've never eaten unclean food. And he panics. God says, don't do it. Do it 3 times. He repeats it. So Peter will finally get it. Nothing was harder for the initial Jewish Christians in the first century than the idea that the kosher laws are gone. That was just impossible for them to fathom, which is why there's whole chapters in the New Testament, numerous places in the New Testament, devoted to explaining this issue about the food, kosher foods. All right, so Jesus started in phase 1 by throwing all their traditions out on the junk heap where they belong. Then, phase 2, he points them back to the heart instead of external forms. And then he goes all the way and cancels the entire system of kosher foods that have defiled the Jewish people for thousands of years. All the symbolic laws of the Old Testament, they're just gone. Nothing you can eat can make you unclean. In fact, the statement isn't even limited to just food. In the context, he's talking about food, but he just says, nothing outside you can make you unclean. No influence. Now think about that. Because if we get back to our original question, what is the source of evil? Where does it come from? When Jesus says it doesn't come from anything outside of you, that is a revolutionary idea, not just for Jews. That is a revolutionary idea for all people. We all naturally think that we're infected with uncleanness from some outside source, right? That's just the way that we think. Some influence. That's why we think that we can deal with our sin problem by just separating ourselves from certain influences. I'll stop doing that. I'll stop hanging around that. And I'll stop watching that. I'll get away from these influences, and then I'll solve my sin problem. And different people have different ideas about what influences are causing the sin, where the evil comes from. Religious people tend to think in terms of religious defilement coming from religious taboos, breaking those. Secular people, it's cultural taboos. For conservatives, it comes from TV and movies and the internet and video games and all that stuff. For psychologists, it's imposed on you by people who mistreated you, or maybe it was toxic masculinity or bullying or trauma or whatever. The social justice crowd will say that evil comes from oppressive governments and people in power and rich people. And then, of course, the greatest evil of all, evil corporations. Right? Jesus said, no, none of that. None of that is the source of evil. So what is it? Where does the evil come from? Well, it's right here in verses 21 to 23. And this is just devastating. Look at this. Verse 21. For from within, out of men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. It all comes from inside you. Jesus doesn't hold back, does he? I mean, he just tells it like it is. And at first it seems kind of harsh, but isn't that what we need? Think about your life. Where do the real changes come from? Don't they come from those people that are just honest with you? I mean, most of us have like one friend who they'll just tell it like it is. They'll just be brutally honest, right? They'll tell you. I just this morning there was a guy in our men's group who was telling his testimony, and he talked about how for 10 years of his life, his Christian life, was just wasted. He didn't make any progress spiritually. And then finally, a friend just pinned him down. And the way he did it, he was just talking to his friend about his financial troubles. He's like, oh, I got all these financial woes, and I'm struggling financially. I don't have enough money. And the guy said, well, you realize you're sinning, right? In the way that you're handling your money, you realize you're sinning, right? And the guy at first, this guy was real offended. But that got him to realize, oh, I'm supposed to be doing something different. The Bible has commands that how I'm supposed to handle my money. I'm disobeying God. And it turned him around, turned his whole Christian life around. Those are the friends that have the most impact on us in the long run, aren't they? But there's not many of those people out there. You need a friend. You need at least one friend that'll give it to you straight, that'll just say, they're not afraid, they'll just say, look, what you're doing here it's sin. I don't want to hurt you, but it's not pleasing to the Lord. You need to repent. You need to do something different. That's sin. And you're getting a little fat. That kind of a friend, they'll tell you whatever you need to hear, they'll just tell you. Jesus is that kind of friend right here. He tells it straight. What is the source of evil? Your own heart. Your own heart. All these things that make us filthy in God's sight originate inside us. Good luck. If you're going to try to avoid bad influences that make you evil, good luck, because the worst influence in your life is right inside your chest. And it's incurable. Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? So this is Jesus' answer to the question about the source of uncleanness. And he says it comes from inside. It's revolutionary, and yet it really shouldn't be any big surprise, right? I mean, it's self-evident, isn't it? This is obvious. I don't know of any passage in the whole Bible that's easier to prove than verses 21 to 23 right here. How can you deny it? Even the people who try to deny it, all they do is transfer the problem from their heart to somebody else's heart, but it still comes from a human heart, right? If you say it comes from TV and movies and internet and all this, how did all that evil get into that evil programming? Human beings, right? It wasn't dolphins It wasn't Martians, right? It's human beings. If it comes from evil corporations, what are evil corporations? What are corporations? They're people. Right? No document, no legal entity ever committed an evil act. Only human beings can commit evil acts. If it was your parents and they inflicted on you, what are they? They're human beings with human hearts, right? At some point, it has to come from the human heart. No matter how hard you try to push it off to another source, the origin of evil always ends up being the human heart. Who can possibly deny? Just look at this list of sins. Adultery, murder, stealing. How can you possibly deny that comes out of the heart? Right? It comes out of the heart. Where else could it possibly come from? Even if somebody pushed you into it, still, why were you pushable? It's like, it's not my fault. She just pushes all my buttons. Why do you have buttons? Did Jesus have buttons? He got all the same bad treatment from people that we get. He never flew off the handle. Why? Because even though Jesus faced all the evil influence of the world that we face, still there was no corresponding evil in his heart that latched on to that stuff. And so he didn't sin, but we do because we have evil in the heart. At the beginning, I asked you to think of a time in your life when you felt really dirty on the inside. Most likely you thought of some act that you committed, some sin, some physical action you did that was really bad. But we find out that's not what made you unclean. The really hard news is you were unclean long before that. The reason you did that act is because of the unclean that was already in you. We tend to think we are what we do, but in reality, we do what we are. So Jesus brings this crushing indictment on the entire human race here. Look again at the list. Just look how ugly this is. It's like a wasp, like somebody kicked a wasp nest, and it just you kick out this whole swarm of stinging, biting horrors rise up out of our hearts when it gets kicked. And just this whole list here. And then the passage ends, verse 23. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. And that's it. That's the end of the passage. The next verse moves on to the next section of Jesus leaves the country and goes somewhere. That's it. What kind of an ending is that? I mean, this just sounds morbid. He's like, your hearts are just hopeless cesspools, evil factories. The end. That's a little abrupt, isn't it? Where's the conclusion? When Jesus does that, what he's doing is he's forcing you to stop and go back through the passage and see the conclusion in the words that he's already said. It's all through there. And so I did that. I combed back through the passage and I looked, what are the applications for this? Why is he telling me this information? What good is it to me? And there's 4 things that stood out to me, and I'll just give you these 4. First, this is great information for us because in our war against sin, this passage exposes the wrong solution, the wrong front to fight the battle, the place that isn't the source of evil. So we don't waste our time fighting that. And that is legalism. I mean, when you look at this list, as soon as you look at the list, can you see how utterly useless legalism is? Look at this horror show again in verses 21 to 23. All this wickedness in our hearts. Which one of the Pharisees' traditions or rituals is going to do anything about any of that mess? I mean, hand washing? That's going to take care of malice and greed and murder and all. For that matter, we could include even God's ritual commands, right? What symbolic laws in the Old Testament are going to take care of this problem of my heart? Avoiding shellfish? In fact, we can even take it another step further and say, even God's moral law doesn't help. It doesn't have the power to change the human heart. God says, do not covet. What does that make your heart want to do? It just makes you want to covet all the more. Romans 8:3 says the law was powerless to justify you because it was weakened by how sinful our nature is. There's no power in the law to change your nature. You can't cure uncleanness of the heart by law keeping any more than you can cure rabies by putting a muzzle on a dog. And when we understand that, we will abandon legalistic solutions. We'll stop fighting the war on that front, which will totally change the way that we live our lives. It'll change the way we think about ourselves. It'll change the way we think about others. And it'll eliminate judgmentalism, right? As long as I'm focused on external rules, then I'm always going to be pointing a finger at people that don't keep the rules that I keep, that break the ones that I'm able to keep, right? But if I realize that that's not the issue isn't that, the issue is the heart, how can I be critical? How can I be critical of you if I can't even see your heart? If I see you smoke a cigarette or drink a beer or yell at your wife or do less work in the church than I do, that stuff I can see, but I can't see what you spend most of your day loving or hating or hoping in or trusting in. I can't see any of that. If you do a sinful action, I don't know if that thing that you did is the delight of your soul or if it's something that you hate with all your inner being. I can't see if your repentance is real or phony. I can't see any of it. How could I possibly judge you? How could I call you a hypocrite? Did you know that the word hypocrite is never used in the Bible by anyone except for Jesus? Nobody. Jesus uses that word 17 times. 17 times he's calling people hypocrites. But nobody else. Why? Because Jesus is the only one that can see the heart. The word hypocrite means your actions don't match what's in your heart. Well, I can't say that about you. I don't know what's in your heart. I can see your actions, but I don't know what's in your heart. Only God knows the heart. Now, there are plenty of Christians who think they're the exception to that. They think they know people's motives. They know why people do what they're doing. They can see into people's heart. They think it's the gift of discernment. They think 1 Samuel 16:7 really says, man looks on the outward appearance, but me and God look on the heart. Right? That's kind of their attitude. But that's absurd. That's absurd. We don't have that power. We don't have that power. If you think we do, try it. Just try it right now. Just take a good look at me. Just gaze into my eyes. Look hard at me and tell me right now. Am I coveting something? How much do I love my wife? Which of my actions tonight or today had prideful or selfish motives mixed in with good motives? And what's the mixture? Just tell me. You don't know any of that. You can't possibly know. You have no idea. I barely know. See, focusing on the heart really spoils the party when you want to be critical of people. Especially since not only can I not see your heart, but I can see my heart, and that's not a pretty picture. If we're even a little bit honest with ourselves about what goes on inside us, how could we possibly be critical of anybody? If you see someone smoke a cigarette or fail to use his turn signal or whatever it is that makes you look down on people, be critical, if you see that, are you going to assume from that they're worse? You look at that and then you look at your own heart and you see that whole disgusting hornet's nest in verses 21 to 23. Are you really going to be critical of that guy with the turn signal? Isn't that the pot calling the kettle black a little bit? Except for you don't even know how black he is. You just really know how black your heart is. Can you imagine the difference it would make in our judgmentalism in the church if we understood that the issue is the heart? That only the heart can be unclean? And only God can see the heart? If we really believed that, instead of justifying ourselves and criticizing others and condemning other people, we would always have the perspective that I am the worst person I know. I am the worst sinner I know. Why? Because I can see the filth of my heart. I can't see the filth of anyone else's heart, but I see mine every day. How would that change our relationships? How would that change our marriages? If we thought this way, if we had this attitude, how would it change our parenting? We tell our kids, I can't believe you did that. And we're all condemning, I would never dream of doing something like that. When I was your age, I wouldn't have ever thought of that. Oh, really? Oh, really? You would never dream. Why? Why not? Are you not a sinner? What if circumstances were different? You sure Are you positive that you would never dream of doing that evil thing if you were in their same circumstances? When you say, I would never dream of doing something like that, what if Jesus were standing right there at that moment and said, you would never, would you like me to remind you of some of the things that you've dreamed of in your lifetime? Because I remember, let's just take it from, say, your teenage years, and we'll go from there, and I'll remind you of some of the stuff, some of the thoughts that you've entertained in your heart. I mean, is your heart really that much better than theirs? With as much exposure as we have to our own evil, why is this even an issue? Why does Jesus even have to tell us this? Why is this in the Bible? Shouldn't this be the most obvious fact in the world? Why do we need to be told? Here's why. Did you notice the last two items? Look at the list again, verses 21 to 23. Look at the last two items on the list. What are they? Arrogance and folly. That means we're fools and we're proud of ourselves. That's quite the combination, to have folly and arrogance. I mean, our folly is the reason why human wisdom can never solve the problem of our uncleanness. Because we're just full of folly. We're full of foolishness. That means to be a moral fool. How can my own heart figure out a way to clean itself when all it produces is evil and folly? Obviously, nothing I could ever do is going to solve the problem because I'm the source of the problem. If you want to purify some water that you drew out of a filthy well, you're not going to do it by drawing more stuff out of that well. That's not going to work. If my heart is the problem, nothing my heart can ever come up with will ever solve the problem. Neither will any solution from some other sinful well, some other evil heart. It's got to come from God. And all of that should just be patently obvious. But it's not, because another evil our hearts have besides folly is pride and arrogance. Which is just amazing. You would think a heart this twisted and this perverse, this ugly, this diseased would just want to crawl under a rock in shame. But instead it's puffed up with pride and proud of itself and arrogant and looks down on others. That's why we need Jesus to just be honest with us and tell us straight and point out the real source of evil is in our hearts. It should be obvious, but it's not because of our pride. Probably the biggest reason why we're so attracted to legalism, why there's that gravitational pull towards legalism all the time, is because we need legalism to justify ourselves. If I want to feel good about myself, it's a whole lot easier to go down a checklist and say, I didn't touch that, I didn't watch that, I never went there, I didn't do that, I said this, I did all my stuff, and I read my Bible, and I went to this, and I went to that, and I prayed, That's a whole lot easier than looking at my heart and asking questions like, how much did I love God today? How much did I hate evil? What were my attitudes? If I stick with hard issues, justifying myself just gets a whole lot harder, doesn't it? I get a whole lot more dependent on Jesus' grace and His blood covering my sin. But don't think that Jesus' purpose here is just to condemn you. It's not. It's not. It's to motivate you to seek cleansing. He wants to clean you. But you got to seek it first, right? We won't get serious about dealing with the problem until we know how serious the problem is. When people make excuses for not coming to Christ, that just shows they don't have any idea of how filthy they are. Because if you knew, you would want it. You know, when I was a kid, I'll just tell you the story. When I was a kid, I spent a summer on my uncle's dairy farm. Now, the barn where they had all these cows, where they milked the cows with these machines, they had all the cows are lined up in a row, and behind the cows there was a trough where everything that came out of the cows went. It caught the mess that came from the cows. Now, I'm not going to ruin your week by describing what was in there, but I'll just tell you enough. It's enough to know what was in there was like the consistency of a milkshake. Well, one sad day, guess who fell into that trough? It's like the worst day of my life. I fell into that mess. It was so disgusting. I go run into the house, and my aunt meets me there. Now imagine this. Imagine I get to the doorstep and my aunt sees me like that, and she says, "Daryl, get in the shower, take a shower." And I say, "Well, I don't know. People who take showers, they just think they're cleaner than everyone else. And I'm not really into that. I don't know about... She's like, no, seriously, you need to take a shower. Get in there and take a shower. I'm like, I don't know. There's so many brands of soap. I don't know which one is the best one. How could anyone know? And I'm just not into that. And take a shower. You're filthy. You stink. Well, there's plenty of people out there that are dirtier than me, and I've been clean before. And if I did that, if I'm throwing out arguments like that, what does that mean? It means I don't really think I have a problem. But that wasn't what happened. I can tell you, I was desperate. I wanted more than anything else, I wanted someone to get a hose, point it at me, open it up, and spray that stuff off of me. I couldn't wait. I didn't care if it was cold or it was uncomfortable. I just wanted that stuff off of me. See, Jesus is doing us a huge favor by letting us know you're covered in manure. You need to be desperate for a shower, because if you're not desperate, you won't seek it and you won't get the cleansing. So this passage isn't as morbid as it sounds when he just lists all these sins and then ends. It's not morbid. If you want to cure a disease, you've got to figure out the cause, and that's not morbid. If you want to have success in fighting it, you got to find this source, the sin beneath the sin that's causing it. One of the classes, speaking of morbid, one of the classes that doctors have to take in medical school is called morbid anatomy. Morbid anatomy, the word morbid technical meaning is diseased. Morbid anatomy is the field of studying the diseased organs, diseased body parts. Obviously, they have to study that, right? If a med student enrolls in Morbid Anatomy 101, is that a morbid thing to do? No, it's not, because he's got to know how to cure the disease. And so he has to know the cause of the disease. Our granddaughter, Abigail, had to be taken in an emergency C-section because she wasn't moving. That was why they took her. She wasn't moving. So what's the solution? They take her out of her mother's womb. What's the solution? Just get her moving? No. You got to find out why she's not moving. Turns out she wasn't moving because she wasn't getting enough oxygen. Well, so they just give her oxygen? No. They've got to figure out, why isn't she getting oxygen? It was because of trauma to her major organs. Well, what caused the trauma to the major organs? Well, that was caused by a problem with the mucus that her body was producing. It was too thick, and that was causing all kinds of damage. Why? What caused the mucus in her body to be too thick? That was caused by a lack of ability for her body to retain enough salt. Okay, so now what's the solution? Did they just salt her? No. Why isn't she retaining the salt? What's going on? And they kept going down and down and down and down until they finally found the root problem, which was cystic fibrosis, which is causing all that. Now that's something they know how to treat. They didn't know what treatment to give her until they found that root cause, and then they could give her a treatment that will help. I'm so grateful for doctors who have spent countless hours in study of morbid anatomy, because they're the ones that figured all that out. And now they're taking care of her. That's exactly what our sin problem is like. The same thing. We say and do evil things. And we try to deal with it just by changing our actions. It's like we're taking a motionless baby and just moving his arms or something, or we're throwing salt on. And we don't have success because we don't get to the root problem. We don't understand morbid anatomy. And what Jesus is doing here in verses 21 to 23 is giving us a class on morbid analogy of the heart. It's not just a random list of sins. It's a morbid anatomy class. And notice how complex the heart is. We get a lot of insight from this list. Again, it's not just a random list. Sometimes psychologists will criticize biblical counselors because they say we're being too simplistic. When we talk about heart issues, it's just an issue of the heart, and they think that's simplistic somehow. This is anything but simplistic. Just as your body has all kinds of different organs and tissues and systems and all the complexities of your body that interact, it's the same way with your heart, your inner man. Look at the variety of things that Jesus lists here. He starts with evil thoughts. So what is that? That's a function of your mind, right? Your thinking. And then he says, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. Those are physical actions that result from an act of the will, right? A decision that you make. Next one, greed. That involves your desires and your affections, what you love, and your values, what things are more valuable to you than other things. All right? So we've got thoughts, we've got decisions, we've got the will, we've got desires, we've got affections, we've got values. Next one, malice, and then arrogance. Those are both attitudes, an overall attitude. Deceit, that involves the will and speech and values. Lewdness. Lewdness is somebody that's just unrestrained by social restraints. They just have all this immorality and they don't care about mores. That has to do with, again, attitudes and values. Envy, that has to do with desires and affections. Slander, that has to do with words and attitudes. Folly, that's the product of your thinking and your values and your perspectives. So the point is, there's all these, when you sin, if you're serious about dealing with it, getting that cancer out of there, you've got to look down to these kinds of things. You've got to ask yourself questions like this. Anytime you're dealing with any sin in your life, here's some questions for you. What were the inclinations? Start with desires. What were the wrong desires that led me into this sin? And what inclinations of my heart caused me to have those kinds of desires? And what were my motives? And what feelings and emotions led me to be vulnerable to that temptation when it hit? And what thought patterns resulted in those emotions? I felt that way because I was thinking a certain way. What thought patterns started that? What perspectives did you have that caused you to have those kinds of thought patterns? What sinful attitudes and desires caused you to look at things from those perspectives? And what caused those attitudes? What was the origin of your desires? 1 John 2:16 says, all your desires come either from God or from the world. Where did the desires come from? What was your heart in love with that it should have hated? What is your heart apathetic about that it should love and rejoice in? What were you hoping in at the time? What were you trusting in at the time? What were you seeking? And here's the bottom of it all. What wrong beliefs were the soil out of which all that stuff grew? You short with your spouse? You just give a sharp remark or whatever? Don't just say, oh, I'm sorry, I need to watch my tongue. No. Ask yourself, where did my selfish attitude come from? What pattern of thoughts nurtured that attitude? What started those thoughts? Why did I want to think those thoughts? Keep going deeper until you find those culprits and then sever those roots. That's where you deal with the problem of sin. Otherwise, you'll just pick the apples, you'll pull the weeds, and 5 more will just come right up after. All right, one final point of application. This is the 4th out of my 4. When we look at this passage, we see how severe the problem is of our evil. And we see there's no human solution, and we're just left at the end of the passage like, what hope is there? Is there a power somewhere in the universe that can take care of this impossible problem of my incurably evil heart? Well, how about the guy in verse 19 who cleansed all foods? Right? Foods, he's got the power to cleanse pork. He's got the power to make every all these unclean foods that God himself made unclean in the Old Testament, this guy can just make them all clean. He has the power to cleanse all foods just with an act of his will. He can do that. He can cleanse anything, right? He can cleanse anything. Jesus Christ is the solution. And how does that solution come to you? What's the avenue? Jesus is there for everybody, but not everyone is being clean. So how do you get that cleaning? Well, what hints do we have in this passage? Let's go back to phase 1. What did the Pharisees, how did they get it wrong? What did they do? Verse 8, you have let go of what? The commands of God. Verse 9, you have a fine way of setting aside what? The commands of God. Verse 13, you nullify the Word of God, by your tradition. So that's very clear. The wrong way to do it is human tradition. The right way is the Word of God. That's the pipeline. That's the fire hose that'll spray you off. When you deal with sin in your life, keep digging until you find you got a handle on the complex root causes down beneath the sin, all the attitudes and beliefs and perspectives and values and all the rest. And when you find out what does the Word of God say about this wrong value? What does the Word of God say about how to change this desire? What does the Word of God say about having this wrong perspective? How do I get a better perspective? Find out what the Word says, apply it to your heart, and cleansing will come. And the power will all come from the Lord Jesus Christ.
Thank you for listening. If you found today's episode edifying, why not share with a friend? A simple post on social media can change a person's day. This season, the Food for Your Soul podcast features excerpts from our sermon series on the Gospel of Mark. Over 130 expository sermons covering every verse. You can find those and hundreds of other sermons for free download on drichardferguson.com. Until next time, rejoice in the Lord always and set your mind on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God.